Hi and welcome to the lesson about polyglot persistence. So far we have been considering a batch layer in terms of a single storage, but in fact it doesn't need to be the case. You may have different storages adapted to maybe your different parts of the company consuming the data you're ingesting, or maybe to the much more specialized query databases for the consumers. And that's also the key point here, that a single database, a single storage will not necessarily fulfill all your use cases. For example, here we can see that we have some key-based access need. So we can implement it differently on different solutions, and each of the solutions have different applications. So for example, in-memory cache will be much more faster to access, but possibly we'll have to do some checkpointing or might lose the data stored in memory. Key value store will be a little bit slower, and RDBAM relational database will be also a bit slower, but we'll have this transactional guarantee that these two not necessarily have. And the key point here, if we write the same data into 3 different places, is to ensure that the data is consistent. So the same record has always the same format in all of these 3 values. For example, if you do some data enrichment, it's good to have this data enrichment made in a single job and not in the 3 jobs, for example, one here, and one here, so that the data is kept consistent across these different storages. So what about the design? So first we may imagine a use case when we don't have this polyglot persistence and we have 2 different consumers. The first consumer is a mobile app and another is data processing job. And the mobile app has this requirement. It needs to read data in the milliseconds latency and gets only some specific keys, whereas the data processing job needs to get as much data as possible to be performant and at much more higher latency because every hour. So here we can see that having an object store, so the data which is stored in big files, doesn't necessarily fulfill these 2 needs. This milliseconds latency and key-based access will not be possible, and if they do, naturally it will introduce some overhead here that will make this data processing job perform poorer. And the idea here is to have another data processing job that will synchronize our streaming data to the batch layer and write it to the key value NoSQL store that is much more adapted to this milliseconds latency and key-based access for our mobile app. And there are 2 big types of this polyglot persistency. So the first of them is the duplicated type and another is unique. In the duplicated one, we have the same dataset stored always fully in each of the stores, and another one is having this dataset splitted by need. So for example, in a relational database, we only need to get some user transactions. In key value store, we only need to have the session information. In the search engine, we only need the addresses because maybe our front end has some search capacity on the addresses for the users. And generally there are 2 ways you can implement this polyglot persistence. Each time the key part is that there is some single data set present fully or partially on different specialized databases. And what are the challenges for the polyglot persistence? The first of them is, of course, the consistency. So how do you ensure that all these databases store consistent information? And this consistency not necessarily means having the correct format, but also having the good and synchronized latency, because you don't want your, for example, relational database to have real-time users, and for example your key value stores have the users only from 3 hours ago, because it will of course introduce a lot of discrepancy for the consumers using this data and obviously to the end users of your system. So another one is about the complexity, because you don't have one database, you have multiple databases, each having its own specificities, and you will need to master them all, or at least be very fluent and comfortable working with them. Source of truth is another problem. So now you need to clearly identify this source of truth. So the database storing the reference data for the polyglot persistence records, and very often it will be a streaming broker where we will ingest data in real time, and directly from it we will have the customers dedicated to this polyglot stores, polyglot database. Data privacy is another one, because sometimes it's easier to clean PII data, or maybe to remove user data when the user asks us to do so in some databases, and it's much more complicated to do in another databases. So it's another challenge you will need to face. And despite these challenges, polyglot persistence is something that may help you to ensure good data usage in your organization, because you will always fulfill the needs of your customers by providing them the most optimized data access possible. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next lesson.